Munthe, who is the chief executive of Demotix. I forgot to ask you, a great title for it. I'm wondering at which drink that came over. Demotix, which is, I think it's fair to say, citizen journalism made real. If you want to quarrel with that definition, that's fine. But certainly the idea of ordinary people doing stuff and then bringing that into the mainstream. And I hope that Turi will talk to us more about that, because it's extremely important and developing. And they're very much at the cutting edge of that. Guy Atchison, the co-editor of Open Democracy's UK blog, again very closely following all the protests in the UK, especially recently, and published this very day, I think, at least online, and about to come out in print also, Fight Back, a reader on the winter of protest. Paul, I forgot to say, and I did mean to say, was also the author, Paul on my left, was also the author of Live, Working or Die Fighting, How the Working Class Went Global, published a couple of years ago. And so all of this sense of both protest here in the UK and globally, a subject which, as you mentioned earlier, certainly fascinates me. A book that a friend and I published a few months ago, where I have to confess there were almost no Arabic stories in there. We searched so hard, and it seemed this was a place that wasn't going to change at all. And in the meantime, so extraordinarily dramatic things have been happening there as well, which was a reminder that even though the book said, don't be so pessimistic, things can change, that probably applies to the author as well. I wanted to first just put the main question of the evening: does the mainstream...
You've forgotten to introduce Jacky.
Did I not do that? Yeah, thank you for the prompting. Thank God the prompt, otherwise you'd have sat there politely, wouldn't even have said. Jacky Rowland, actually, I realized the only one who I know properly before this evening, who did fantastic work in the Balkans, where we were both together and enjoyed both the lead up to the fall of Milosevic, where Jacky was the only person who managed to be legally or semi-legally in the country when that was happening, and won a Royal Television Society Award, I think, in connection with that at least, and many other things. Has done lots of other brilliant work over the years. Now, was then in the BBC, now with Aljazeera, and is right now back from Cairo, got back here on Sunday, I think. So absolutely fresh from Cairo, and obviously Aljazeera as the dramatic, I mean, not really that new kid on the block, to be honest, but certainly I would guess, although I haven't done a data search, the number of hits for Aljazeera and talking about Aljazeera, let alone, which we'll talk about, the number of viewers, dramatically up, people understanding, and so it'll be interesting to hear a bit more from Jacky why that might be, and from others as well, but certainly it clearly fills a role. There's no question about that. A dramatically important role. People have seen that worldwide, and we'll talk about that as well. So I will start, I think, with Turi first. I could play this either way. Tell us, does the mainstream get it? You are working together with, but slightly outside. What is your experience? What do you think are the things which work easily with the mainstream? Do you think that what you are doing at the moment, this kind of citizen journalism, if one can call it that, of people feeding their photographs and their videos into the mainstream, could that have existed before in mindset terms? Technologically, of course, it couldn't really have existed in that easy way, but even in mindset terms, do you think it was there before, or have both mindset and technology changed at the same time?
So thank you very much indeed. What Demotix does, very, very simply, just so I explained the platform, it's an open platform to which anybody can join anywhere around the world, where you come to upload your news, stories, pictures, videos, whatever it might be. We then host it. It goes onto our website, which is seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and we take the best of that content and then feed it through to the mainstream media. So what essentially we're trying to do is to build a dislocated, outsourced newswire to cover a different kind of bailiwick from, say, the AP or Reuters. We've now got around 4,000 active contributors in, we think, every single UN recognized country around the world, and we bring in tens of thousands of images and many thousands of stories on a monthly basis, which we then push out. What I'd like to talk about here, as well as trying to answer some of your questions, is just to give you an understanding of the ways in which we, as non-mainstream media, manage the kind of protest that we've been seeing both in the Middle East, but also here in the UK and elsewhere, because there are real differences. So we were talking about it with the team a couple of days ago, and we were trying to define what we thought of ourselves as. And I think what we thought of ourselves as was not mainstream, but your stream media. So if there's a Wall Street and a Main Street, we're the your stream media. So first off, to talk very, very high level, and I know many of you will have read the Malcolm Gladwell article that you want to bring up about how protests has existed since the beginning of time, and Twitter and Facebook are just Western excrescences. They're not. There's nothing concrete about it. They don't actually have any. Don't actually make any difference to what's been going on. And just very briefly to talk about that, because while it's absolutely clear that there have been social and political protests across the world forever. I've just finished Eric Hobsbawm's book, 1789 to 1848, which is the age of revolutions, and my God, they happen every 15 minutes over that period across the whole of Europe in a contagious way, in a way which is similarly contagious to what we've seen just now across the Middle East. So yes, these things have been going on for a very, very long time. I suppose the question is now, does social media, does Twitter and Facebook and all these other things, do they have an impact on not just the speed at which these protests can coagulate, can appear, but also the speed with which they can transfer across territories and their likelihood of success. And that, in a sense, the proof of the pudding, we'll see when we've figured out ways in which we can crunch that data. How can we compare what's going on right now in the Middle East to a similar period pre-web, say, and have a sense of what the pluses have been, because it may very well be a zero-sum game. Many of you will know this now superstar of the Web 2.0 debate, a man called Evgeny Morozov, who's every minute of the day will jump up and remind people that social media has given governments and administrations far deeper tools to figure out who's doing the protesting and find them later, as we saw, by the way, with Iran 09. The Iranian government searched all the social networks and really got properly use them as a way of getting back to protesters and activists. So it might be a zero-sum game insofar as you give a whole bunch of tools, but you're giving them to both sides, or we'll figure out that these tools actually serve the dislocated people power better. So I think the debate is very much still open to question, but without doubt it's had an impact. I know we've got a very, very short period of time, so what I want to do is to explain to you how we've dealt with protests and how we display protests.
Can I come back to you?
Please,
I do want to hear more. I want to hear a little bit of kind of opening thoughts from a couple. But I promise, and if I haven't if I haven't done, you're welcome to give me a kick across the table. Jacky, you're in a sense suspended between the two. I mean, mainstream media or not mainstream media. That you are absolutely mainstream. You're now one of the world's largest broadcasters, and yet you're still kind of outside. Alternative, yes, which is a kind of an odd position to be when, in some sense, you're not at all. How would you answer the question? And indeed, to what extent do you see? How would you place Al Jazeera within that mainstream or not mainstream? And what do you think it is that has been kind of missing from mainstream and that Al Jazeera brings in? And are there things that Al Jazeera is still too mainstream and doesn't comes in from the side still?
Well, I think it's largely to do with just the geographical spread. I mean, some of the other networks, particularly the US networks, took a decision to really claw back on their foreign coverage. We saw bureaus being closed left, right and centre. And Al Jazeera was doing exactly the opposite. It was opening bureau. I mean, Al Jazeera, it was the idea it was going to be the voice of the South talking to the North, the undeveloped world talking to the developed world. And so when this happened, first in Tunisia and then in Egypt, it really played to our strengths, if you like, because we'd been investing in the developing world at the same time as the more established television and indeed, newspapers were pulling out and entrenching their foreign operations in a way. So I think to begin with, people were tuning into Al Jazeera simply because we were there, we were present on the ground, and they weren't. As to whether we're mainstream or alternative or whatever, there's clearly always the ambition that we would be mainstream, that we'd be a big player. I mean, we're a relatively new player on the block in that we've only been around for about 5 years. But, obviously, trading to an extent or coming off the back of the longer standing heritage of Al Jazeera Arabic, which really is the big kid on the block as far as Arab satellite television is concerned. You were talking before, Steve, just before we came up here, about this whole question of, how it affects how our media, how well equipped the mainstream or the conventional media are to kind of deal with these phenomena in a way which is different from what Turi would be doing. I would say one of the things that I found most difficult was just the actual way you tell the story, because the standard narrative that you have like the prime minister or the president, the person who they're trying to overthrow, and then you have the leader of the opposition, and just these protagonists were not there. You didn't have an opposition leader, you didn't have a leader of this revolution. It was I hate to use kind of management speak, but it's the spider and the starfish. This whole idea that, a spider type organisation, which is very much, the Egyptian state. You have a spider, you cut off a leg, you've got a disabled spider, you cut off the head, you've got a dead spider. A starfish, you cut off a leg, the starfish will regenerate the leg, and apparently, even if I'm told, the cut off leg can regenerate a whole starfish. I mean, what we were looking at in the revolution in Egypt, it was a real example of a starfish type organisation rather than a spider type organisation. All these different Facebook and Twitter and all the different Facebook groups. It was a leaderless revolution, which presents the journalist with a challenge. The kind of standard narrative, we haven't got the protagonists. It was, if you like, it was a movement looking for a leader, or a movement doing pretty well without a leader. But people on the ground, Egyptians who I was talking to directly in the aftermath of this, said that for them was the big strength of this revolution, because if there'd been a leader, you were just talking about the Iranian experience, if there'd been a leader, then the Egyptian authorities could either have arrested him or her or co-opted them. The fact was that there was no one really for them to arrest or co-opt. So it worked for them, although it presented us as journalists with quite a challenge of actually, it was narrating not the kind of story that we would be used to narrating.
Yeah.
Tell us there's lots of questions I want to follow up, but I want to hear from everyone. You were looking especially at the UK protest guy. There, did you feel, there was wall-to-wall coverage clearly, both on TV and on the newspapers. Did you feel the story broadly was being told? Did you have the sense that the mainstream media didn't get it and were looking at particular things which fundamentally misread the situation, as it were?
Okay, so I'd say, I'm a student at UCL. I was involved in the occupation we had there, which took up about a month of my time, and I was involved in a lot of the organising of the sort of different actions that took place last term. I suppose as a student they teach you to sort of challenge the terms of the question, so I wonder if this idea of mainstream and non-mainstream is a useful way of thinking about it. Particularly I think it's much more vague now, the boundaries between them. For example, at our occupation we had a lot of people there who wrote their own blogs, who had their own Twitter accounts, and people who actually contributed to mainstream publications occasionally, like Comment is Free, or even to things like the New Statesman. We had Laurie Penny, who was one of the sort of main voices within the mainstream, who was sort of living full-time in the occupation. So I think sort of the boundary between what is mainstream and what isn't is breaking down. Paul, who works for the BBC, has his own blog, he has his own Twitter account. So firstly, the boundary is not so important. So I think perhaps the best way to think about it is in terms of, are these kind of corporate commercial media which respond to certain imperatives, certain market imperatives, or are they authentically grassroots, not driven by these different imperatives? Now, traditionally, I think the societal role of the media, certainly the corporate media in this country when it comes to protest, has been, if it's a sort of largely inoffensive A to B march from Trafalgar Square to Hyde Park to hear Tony Benn give the same speech, then their role is to ignore it. Or give it a few seconds in the news. And if it's a march which may divert from A to B and actually start to cause a bit of disruption, their role has been to build up the possibility of violence and in the run-up to it. And for example, we saw this with the sort of G20 protests in 2009, right? You remember at the beginning of 2009, after we'd had the banking bailout, the Daily Mail, the right-wing press, but also the Observer and the Guardian were hyping up what was they called the Summer of Rage, which was a phrase used by the Met. Now, some of us were thinking, excellent, the Summer of Rage, here we go, bring it on. But obviously the function of that was quite clear. It was to create this image of violent, disruptive protests within the mainstream, to then justify and legitimise the police repression which followed. And in 2009 we saw some quite brutal tactics which got their first sort of real national use, which was kettling, of course, and then the brutal attack and killing of Ian Tomlinson, the newspaper vendor who was walking away from police harmlessly with his hands in his pockets. And the coverage of that event by the corporate media was interesting, I think. You had pieces in the Evening Standard saying that the police medics attempting to help Ian Tomlinson were pelted with bricks by anarchists. That was the mainstream media narrative. Now that was actually challenged by people who were there on the ground, people with smartphones, people who had recorded it and put it on YouTube. And it turned out that the narrative events that was in the mainstream was total nonsense. And actually, he'd been attacked by police officers, right? And then the activists, the protesters, had gone to his aid. So that was what actually happened. So I think perhaps I'd like to see it not in terms of mainstream and non-mainstream, but in terms of, is the production of news, is the consumption of news being driven by kind of certain certain agendas, certain corporate agendas which they have to meet. And I think I'd like to think that we're seeing those particular agendas being challenged and corrected by people who now have access to the means of production through social media, through smartphones. And I mean, that's an example of 2009, but there's plenty more from the most recent protests as well.
Thank you. Can I jump in very quickly and ask whether we've got I just tweeted something that you've said, and I've got a ping back from members of Global Voices saying, is there a hashtag? Are you live tweeting? What's it?
Let's make one up. Let's make one up.
So I reckon it's Protest FC, right? Frontline Club, Protest Frontline Club hashtag. If anybody cares, do we all have? And do we all have Twitter addresses that we want to?
Yeah. Paul Mason News.
Yeah, Paul Mason News.
Guy Aitchison, just one word.
Jacky with a Y, Aljaz.
And I'm Turi Munthe.
Very good. I come to you, Paul, as the representative of the mainstream here. Yeah. You represent BBC Newsnight, you represent the mainstream. And yet you've written incredibly interestingly about...
Despite the handicap.
I didn't mean yet. I said, forget the and yet. Can I replay that sentence? You've written extraordinarily interestingly, and I want to question in a sense. I mean, I'm interested if you feel, is there things missing? You talked, I will take one phrase out of many of the interesting things that you've written recently. It was interesting that one of the series of things you wrote was saying, well, I was going to do this piece, and the editors were interested, and then they dropped it. I thought that's one of the things that online does, is that when the editors suddenly drop something later in the afternoon, you can say, yes, but this is still interesting. And of course, it did get enormous interest. So one of the bits that you mentioned there was saying that people use social media as the mainstream media has now woken up to, but this obsession with reporting they use Twitter is missing the point of what they use it for. So I'm interested for you to kind of say a little bit about what are these things really about, and secondly, is there actually anything that's missing from what the mainstream media has given us? And sorry, since you do have limited time, I shall throw in something that is, has all of the online, the blogging and lots of kind of new journalism, if you like, has that in fact changed mainstream journalism in any case, that it's much more open to other influences than it was? So
the answer to the last one there is yes, but I don't think that's the most interesting question. The most interesting question is, what do the media get about what is happening in the world? I mean, my link to Egypt is tenuous, but I was following various Egyptian bloggers because I follow and talk to sort of, as it were, anti-globalist, autonomist protesters. So Three Arabawi, Hossan al-Hamalawi, who's a leftist blogger in Egypt. I was known to me, and through that I was following a lot of the stuff in the lead up to that Jan 25th. But I haven't been there, so I would defer to Jacky about that. Look, what I was trying to say in the blog, what I would say is this. It's the media gets that there is as Rupert Murdoch gets, that there's a digital generation out there. But what it's obsessed with is a little bit of the form of what that generation is doing, rather than with the content. And the content is very, very different to the protest activism of when I was 20, 25. Very different, and so much so that sitting in the pub with a bunch of members of something called the Really Free School, which is a free university in a squat in Bloomsbury, I convinced myself and convinced them that we actually did we had different social realities, and then the morning after, in my pajamas, I wrote this blog, which was about what is it? Okay, and what I think it is, the best way to sum it up is there's a book called The Coming Insurrection, and I'm convinced now that only me and Glenn Beck in the mainstream media have read it. We've drawn radically different conclusions from it. But Beck's done an entire programme about the coming insurrection. And when I first read it in 2007, I thought, look, I know where this is coming from. It's autonomism, it's deep anarchism. They're advocating methods that take them or leave them. There's a limited usefulness to them. And the 9 authors have got arrested on a terrorism trial by the French state. So, limited. I wasn't convinced that it was the thing. But covering your occupation, covering the SOAS occupation, covering the demos and the riots, I emailed one of the bosses of the BBC and said quite early, look, we better start covering this as if it is May 68, even if it isn't, because you'll be sorry if it turns out to be, and you didn't. And they said, yeah, right, I'll do it. And in fact, my bosses on Newsnight, as soon as they realised, I knew some of the people, said, let's go, do it, let's do that story in that way, in that paradigm. So what is it, covering that I then realised is that the methods in the coming insurrection, which are quite radical, form communes everywhere, be decentralised, be horizontal, were spontaneous and organic, certainly to the British student movement. I think they are spontaneous and organic to a bit of the Egyptian and Tunisian movement. They're pretty prevalent, in a lot of movements. And what are they? It's horizontalism, it's decentralisation, using disorganisation to swarm around hierarchies and defeat them. A principle that the US military discovered in the Millennium 2002 military exercises, where Iran beat the USA. Theoretically, and they had to stop the exercise by firing all its cruise missiles at once, apparently, at the same ship. So the horizontalism thing is important, and then the aspect of technology that makes this work where it didn't before, I think, is this aspect of being able to use the information technology, and the technology isn't the platforms, the technology is the network. I mean, all computer geek people like me, I hasten to add, do understand that the network is the great invention of the 21st century, and that it can defeat the hierarchy, it can replace the hierarchy. But what is it within the network that's working? I mean, some of the things you can identify, and it should be really obvious as journalism students, as to journalists, is memes. So a meme is a better way of it's Richard Dawkins who invents the term. It's like an idea gene that replicates itself. Now, buy the theory or not, I don't know whether I buy the theory, I buy the description that, for example, one of the protesters said to me in Britain, look, memes allow you to market test ideas really quickly, and the 3 things happen to them. Either they prevail, or they bubble under, or you quickly realise they're not going anywhere. And what the usefulness of this to the protesters is that they can just they can test out modes of action and then withdraw from them. I tried on them the idea of, what if to talk to somebody in a Bulgarian squad, you had to pass a resolution at UCL occupation, then that had to go to the national NUS, and if it didn't pass, then you wouldn't go any further, but if it did, it would go to an international student body, and then they would send a fax down to the Bulgarian student body, and then they would send, and eventually somebody in Bulgaria would say, oh, the British student supporters. Okay. Well, you laugh, but that is the way all protest movements, and we're including here the Paris Commune, the revolutions of 1848, the Bolshevik Revolution. As I wrote in the blog, men hung under the trestles of railway carriages to make the kind of international links I've just described without having to go through hierarchies. But now it's there, you've tweeted it. And they couldn't imagine that world. And I think we in the mainstream media, many of my colleagues, have trouble with understanding the power of information in a world where it flows like that. And so, yeah, I think the answer to the question is that the mainstream media is starting to get the it of what it is, and the it is very simple. The ideas that even 3 years ago were probably contentious and not proven are the main way that young urban intelligence intellectually driven, people who've studied, driven movements do work. And you only have to read the coming insurrection to find out what they are and how they work. However, it's only part of reality, and as you will know all too well, that's only a part of Egypt. It's only a part of America. It's only a part of Britain. We'll see on March the 26th when the TUC has its demo. I've just been interviewing Brendan Barber, and they're already working out ways to try and stop what Project Dual Power, as it's known by its proponents, which is to create mayhem and chaos on that day. They've got it well in hand. They're going to get some FBU members to try and dump things down. So it's only one part of reality, but when it is the reality, as it was with the student occupation, that's how I think we have to try and work out, this is how it works. Don't go and Met police style and say, right, who's in charge here? That is the stupidest question for a mainstream media person to say.
Thank you. I promise I will throw it open for questions in a moment, but I want to abuse my privilege to ask a couple of follow-ups. Jacky, you said some really interesting stuff about how you felt that there was the right moment, as it were, that Aljazeera had expanded and was treating foreign really seriously, which is kind of interesting. I'd never thought of it in those ways, that it parallels my own experience before I joined Amnesty and before Human Rights Watch before that, was at The Independent when it started, and actually it hit randomly, I think. It was very lucky. It started in 1986 with a huge foreign staff at a time when people were cutting back, and it just hit a moment, although actually that moment hadn't begun when it launched, of both perestroika and glasnost and the revolutions and the Gulf War, and it gained a considerable reputation off the back of the fact that foreign was on the front pages. So it sounds as though you're saying, in a sense, Al Jazeera has hit lucky in the same way that all of us are interested in international news. I'm interested first if that is right from your point of view, but what in addition to that, because after all the BBC, for example, had fantastic, vast amounts of coverage, and elsewhere in the world this was also a huge TV story, and all the big TV stations. What was it that made your, the last figure I saw, but several days old, was 2,500%. I'm sure it's like 5,000 or 6,000% up in the meantime. What is the kind of added value, as it were, and what are the lessons of that?
Well, it's slightly arguable whether, one theory I've heard is that Egypt 2011 was for Al Jazeera what the first Gulf War was for CNN. It was that moment. It's slightly arguable in that there was a greater awareness of Al Jazeera following the Gaza war 2 years ago. But I think Gaza, it's still of limited interest compared to the huge resonance of the events in Egypt. It really, and the fact that Al Jazeera had invested, Al Jazeera was concentrating on developing world and particularly the Arab world. I think one of the reasons why it resonated with that larger audience is something that I can't claim credit for at all, because I'm a Western trained, I grew up in the BBC with Paul. The fact that there were so many authentic voices on the ground, the fact that there were British Egyptians, American Egyptians, and that's certainly what some of the younger people spoke to me about. I met some younger people in Egypt, and they're like, hey, who's that dude on the balcony? He seems to kind of understand, Egypt, but he speaks really good English. And I think that was one of the strengths, and I can't claim credit to that at all, because I'm sort of from establishment mainstream media. But I think that was one of the things that certainly kind of hooked some of the younger people. Do you want to talk about the problem with Al Jazeera becoming, because I'm sort of old school journalism, and I believe as a journalist you want to cover the story. If you become part of the story, you've failed in your task. And the problem with what happened in Egypt is that we were made part of the story by the Egyptian authorities. Al Jazeera was banned at an early stage. Al Jazeera was accused of being an instigator or an inciter of violence on the side of the authorities. On the side of the protesters, there was a suspicion, or there was a rumour flying around that Al Jazeera was involved in some kind of conspiracy with the US and Israel to keep Mubarak in power. So we actually became part of the story, and you'd be out covering the protest, and you'd be hearing the chants. And one of the chants would be, "Where is Al Jazeera now?" And when I first heard it, I said to the protesters around me in Arabic, I said, "We're here, we're present," I said. Mawjouda. And they said, "Where?" And I said, "Huna, here." And my fixer's like, "Shut up, Jacky." You've got this crowd, baying for your blood. But it became very difficult to actually cover the story, because, I want to cover the story, and it's like, "Where are you from?" And we were trying to fudge where we were from. We said we were from Paris. We were from Paris, but you want to be able to cover the story without being kind of you want to be apart from the story, not a part of the story. And it becomes difficult when people are trying to suck you into the story and are trying to turn you into a player, whereas what you're just trying to do is you're trying to cover it from the outside.
Thank you. I interrupted you earlier, and I want you to have your say on the differences now on the throw.
I forget everything I was going to say. It's got much more interesting. I just wanted to pick up on two things that what Paul and Jacky just talked about, which is this difficulty in figuring out how you cover the narrative, what kind of narrative you're going to build. You don't have a king on either side of the chessboard. You have to figure out how you tell it, and so one of the things which has fascinated me over the course of series of protests that we've covered from the G20 2 years ago in the UK, through Iran in 2009, June 2009, through UK, so all the economic protests at the end of last year across Europe, and now Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and everything else which is going on, has been how that's shifted, but also who the storytelling nodes are. So you mentioned Hossam al-Hamalawi. Hossam al-Hamalawi is this ultra-leftist rock star who's fantastic, who's a very, very prominent blogger and photojournalist and everything else in Egypt. He's a household name for an enormous number of people now. Al Jazeera carried a whole every hour. I was, as everybody else was looking at it, this is what the Twitter sphere is saying. And actually, I think you used the word earlier just now, is that you used the word authenticity as a sort of the critical issue here, and I think it's something that I think all of us would understand. But if I look now at the ways that people are digesting news, one, because it's unbundled and because it's so bitty and dislocated, by which I mean you make your news yourself, because you're getting Al Jazeera feed, you're getting the BBC, you're getting Twitter, you're getting Facebook profile, you make your story yourself. The people that you're looking for, the voices that you most respect, are voices of authentic voices, which means that actually people like @SandMonkey or @Zenobia or these are names that many of you will have heard over the last few weeks in Egypt, are actually Al Jazeera's in their own right, they're BBC's in their own right. What's been fascinating over Twitter for us has been to see how that hierarchy is built within Twitter very, very quickly. I'll tell this stupid story very quickly about the release of Ronim. Ronim was the Google engineer, Google marketing manager who built the first We're All Khaled Saeed page on Facebook, and was credited with starting quite a lot of the protests. He disappeared for 12 days in Egypt, and at Ronim was this big thing that everyone kept on tweeting about. Where is he? What's the story? How's it working? When he was released, which was not even a week ago, I was on Twitter, as I think a lot of us have been permanently for the last 3 weeks, and saw his account tweet, I'm out. He actually a beautiful line. It's like, it is a blessing to fight for freedom even if your life is in danger. That exploded all over the Twitter sphere. 10 minutes later, Andrew Carvin, who's at NBC, who's at NPR radio, and has been huge in this, cautiously said, this has just appeared from his account. It was then picked up 10 minutes later by a Lebanese American, huge Twitterer, who then said, tweetless, I've just checked this out, and 5 minutes after that I've just spoken to his wife, he's free, she's in floods of tears, everything's extraordinary. 10 minutes later, CNN and Al Jazeera and everybody else, it's happened, it's real. So what you've ended up with is it's a very different way of telling stories, and there's a series of elements obviously to that, just that simple story itself. But I think the big takeaway for us as Demotix, as to how we run news generation and news gathering and sourcing in these particular environments, is that what you need to know is you need to know your community, because actually what gets built across Twitter in 140 characters is not a huge amount unless you've got massive distributed power. And so that's how we've covered everything with Egypt, and that's a change, because in June 2009 when Iran exploded, we were using anonymous Google accounts. We were trying to push people towards proxy servers, which didn't work because the internet was so crunched. But now, with Egypt, we've got a series of Twitter lists. We direct message people. When I get an email in from somebody in Tahrir Square who, fascinatingly, this is a wonderful story for us. They came back to us and said, everybody's talking about Tahrir Square. Bear in mind that Tahrir Square is the safest place in the Middle East right now. You've got everybody looking at it, and there's safety in numbers, even if you're wandering around with kind of colanders on your head to stop the bricks landing on you. Everybody's getting beaten up on the exits and entrances to Tahrir Square, and I don't know this, but I think that I hope that reflects what you felt there. So we got this piece of information. We then pushed it out on Twitter. It was then picked up again. So we could do it privately through direct messaging, so that we could keep up our contributors anonymous, and we could also do it globally. So you can sit, having not been in Egypt, you can sit sort of as an HQ. So that's the first thing I want to say. I'm going to very quickly jump to another thing, which is that something that you've both described as well, is that we, through social media, and it's critical to bear this in mind, we only get a very partial story. We get a very, very partial story. It was patently obvious in Iran 2009 when 0.03% of the Iranian population has a Twitter account. So this mass global freedom against the Ayatollah movement, which we all got hysterical about, actually may not have been the majority voice in Iran. And Egypt seems less obviously the case, but still we really have to bear in mind that we're only getting reflected to us a Western oriented voice in the first place, because they have Twitter, because they know how to write in English for the most part, because Facebook is something they have access to, because they've got a broadband connection. That's already a middle class and above in most of the world.
Could I make the tiniest of micro subsidiary points? You were talking about the way in which Twitter and Facebook were, if you like, fueling events, and the way in which they were providing information. I think it's also equally important to talk about when the internet and when the mobile phone network went down. The mobile phone network was down in Egypt for about 36 hours. The internet was down for several days. Suddenly, you haven't got your Twitter anymore, you can't phone anyone, you haven't got your internet. And in fact, that in itself, the very absence of those tools also fueled events. Because when you've got no information of what's happening, you've got one option: get on the streets. And that's what people did.
It's created expectations, which created a new.
You had no information about what was happening. You couldn't receive your invitation. You couldn't receive your invitation to a Facebook event. You couldn't read the tweets. You wanted to know what was happening. You didn't know if a protest had been called. You get on the street. So the very fact that they suspended the internet and they suspended the mobile phone service may in itself have actually amplified the size of the demonstrators, because that was all that people could do, was get on the streets.
Before we throw it up, I'd be interested from any of you really, whether do we have too great, in terms of predicting what might happen, too great a deference to power and assumption that nothing can really change? I ask this partly as a self-reflection. An event in this very room only a few months ago, last summer, in connection with a book which is supposed to be saying we can change everything. The title of that event was something like can non-violent resistance still change the world? And it seemed at that time it was a reasonable question to ask, because there'd been the 1989 revolutions, there'd been other things, but in the meantime nothing had really happened. And I think it's fair to say, maybe I'll be contradicted by others in this room, but certainly only a few months ago, for any of us, the idea that Cairo would be in the place that it is today would have seemed almost unthinkable. And I could certainly never have imagined, for example, there'd be an Arabic edition of this book which was going to be sold, which is now going to happen. The idea that Cairo would change Tunisia as well, but Cairo most dramatically. And I speak that personally from one who absolutely was arguing that, of course, things can change. I put to you as a kind of thesis, but I'm interested if what any of you may think. There was a quote which I love, which is very old, when Solidarity was still banned in Poland. The Polish writer Czesław Miłosz saying, "Our natural tendency to place the possible in the past leads us to overlook the acts of our contemporaries who defy the presumably immovable order of things and accomplish what at first sight has seemed impossible or improbable." I'm interested, especially probably you, Jacky, having seen both within the Balkans where an unassailable ruler was actually overthrown, and then what we've seen in Cairo, also in Tunisia, in Iran, where there have been huge protests which actually have been blocked at this moment. In Burma a few years ago, we see a kind of stalemate. Do you think that in a way mainstream media, or perhaps all of us generally, perhaps it's not just mainstream, pull back from the idea, well, that could never really change, and then only when people come together now with the help of these new technologies do things do change more?
It's not only technology, it's to do with creativity and using the tools that are at your disposal. If I can just go back briefly to the events of 2000 and the fall of Milosevic, which is when we last saw each other. At that time, again, it was a student movement that was powering it. The student movement was called Otpor, which means resistance. Back then, there wasn't Twitter and there weren't Facebook accounts. But what they used was very, very simple. They had a sticker that said "Gotov ye," he's finished. and they managed to subvert the whole of Milosevic's election campaign. You know, his party would put up this huge Milosevic poster, slap, Gotov Suddenly, an election poster has become a Milosevic poster has become an anti-Milosevic poster. And they had this fist, and they'd be spraying, there'd be this fist symbol that would appear on walls and things, and what is the fist? Who are the fist? And people start talking about it. So you use the tools that are at your disposal. You are very resourceful. Internet is important, Twitter is important, but I mean, I personally was not expecting at all what happened in Egypt, and even less so Tunisia, which I'll speak about in a moment if I have time. But we did in fact have a foretaste of that, because 2 months earlier, I and my team were in the northern city of Alexandria covering the Egyptian parliamentary elections. A bit of a non-story in itself, but while we were there, we met some youth activists, very young people who had posted video on YouTube, and I saw the kettling that you talked about firsthand. Very small demonstrations, and the way that the police would surround them, and as you were talking about looking for ringleaders, looking for the ones who were cheering most enthusiastically, they'd be kind of pulled out and carried off and, you know, beaten up. But at that stage, it seemed a very small phenomenon. We were with them, they were postering in a very poor neighbourhood. They were not doing party political campaigning, they were doing issue-based campaigning. And the issue that they were campaigning on was prices. Prices are going up, you're struggling, think about prices when you vote in elections. And we spoke to them, and a girl who couldn't have been more than about 18 was saying that she had been beaten up by the police. And, you know, what she said to me, I mean, she was very young students, the girls who were out, you know, they were dressed, you know, in hijab. They weren't speaking English, but they were saying, the police beat me up, the police kept beating me until I was on the ground, but that I remember she smiled to me and she said, but that beating made me stronger. So I think, you know, to talk about, you know, yes, Twitter and Facebook, the social media provide tools, but what we're looking at here is the sheer guts and determination and strength of young people who use whichever tools are available to them at any time.
Thank you. I encourage people to ask questions on Tunisia, but I shouldn't monopolise further. So thank you all, and throwing open for your questions from the floor.
Thank you for the talk, it was wonderful. I've been a follower of the Egyptian revolution. I'm very comfortable calling it a revolution now. I used to be scolded every time I do that in London, saying that it's too premature to call it a revolution. But I'm a follower of the Egyptian revolutions even before it actually realized itself. And one of the things that I've noticed in the coverage of Al Jazeera was the fact that they did not somehow use stars to validate their coverage. In the sense, we saw ABC's Amanpour flying into Egypt, doing her interview. Cooper from CNN was, and mainly the stories were that Cooper was in Egypt and Amanpour was there. Al Jazeera actually did not do that, which was very refreshing. We saw stars like Ayman rising to becoming actually a star in journalism, and then constantly in Al Jazeera Arabic and Al Jazeera English, Arabawi and Ala, who are bloggers, Egyptian bloggers, used to appear on the phone, obviously, and speak to Al Jazeera, whether in English or in Arabic. This was very refreshing from a media perspective. I do my postgraduate studies here in London. So this is where Al Jazeera, I think, was very successful in doing that. There was an interesting, this is what I wanted to ask you, there was an interesting shift. First of all, citizen journalism challenged mainstream media, but then mainstream media, which is Al Jazeera, challenged citizen journalism back. So it became very, I'd watch Twitter, I'd have Twitter on one window, but then I'd have Al Jazeera live on another. So Al Jazeera and one of the programs, one of the Jazeera reporters said that in Arabic, she said, "Kul Masri huwa mashru'a sahafi." Every Egyptian is a journalist in the making. With his cell phone, with his Twitter account, with his Facebook. And for Al Jazeera, for a channel to actually adopt that was very refreshing for the youth who actually started the so-called revolution. So I wanted to ask you, was that a deliberate thing before that, or did you just go with the flow as it happened?
So we kind of made a virtue out of a necessity to an extent. I mean, in Tunisia, we weren't there. We were not there when it happened in Tunisia, partly because we were banned. And so if you haven't actually got reporters on the ground, you do what you can, and what you can is bloggers and activists. But it was what Guy was just saying about, you were actually challenging, you were questioning the question about mainstream media and alternative media, and that there is this overlap and there's this blurring. There has been for a long time. I mean, you have the television and you have the internet, and yet the internet carries video, pictures, and you can watch TV on the internet. The very borders themselves are obscuring. And I place myself firmly in the kind of veteran generation here. It was a couple of weeks ago. I was about to do a live or something on Al Jazeera, and I received a message from my producer saying they're asking, can you tweet? I'm thinking, gosh, I'm going to have to set up an account first. I'm assuming it's twitter.com, and so the whole tweeting became part of it. It wasn't. I had to have a tweet that would be, repeated on the TV. So there is all this. And just before Egypt happened, Al Jazeera launched something called the Stream. And the whole idea of the Stream is to literally pull in together all these different sources, like you're doing, Turi, on a kind of more or less day-by-day basis, pulling all these different sources in and, into one forum where they can be found. But I mean, what you mentioned, Anderson Cooper, is an example. I mean, this is just exactly what I was saying before about, for me, the antithesis of journalism is, you don't want to become part of the story. We became part of the story against our will. Mubarak and the others, chose to make us part of the story. I mean, in the case of Anderson Cooper, he chose to make himself the story. But that's a different matter.
Yes.
Hi. Just a very quick question to all of you that I'd like to get a one-line answer for. If you can, just a yes or no and then a bit of an elaboration. You've all spoken a bit about social media, and you all seem to have slightly different takes on it. So, is social media and Twitter and other such forms of activism or whatever actually changing the way in which people protest, or are they just new tools that people are using in different ways?
Start with you.
Yes, it's completely changing the way people are protesting. No, have people only been able to protest since the invention of Twitter? Obviously, patently, screamingly not. So, and I think the jury's still out as to what the kind of impacts this is having. As I was trying to say earlier, there are huge advantages to these things. There are massive disadvantages as well, as almost anybody involved in the Green Movement in Iran 2009 would tell you.
I used to be on Second Life, which is a alternative social media world. It's kind of gone into abeyance now. But one of my favourite places in it was a village which was run entirely according to the principles of German social democracy, and you could get funny German hats as well. Now, the thing is about this, that what the serious point is that it's not social media, it's technology, and the comms revolution in general, I think, has done this to protest. It has reopened an area that I call control, apart from reform and revolution. Reform and revolution are the patterns that, a lot of the old style journalists will go to a place and they'll think, where's the State Department? What are they trying to do? Where's the Islamic fundamentalists? Who are these youth anyway? What's that about? It breaks up some of the power structures that we used to think of, even in societies like Egypt. But even in I think with your struggle, the students, the UK Uncut, Free Gaza, whatever. Look, the point is about this generation is that if they can't have revolution, but they can keep repression at bay, what they will settle for, in fact, coming back to it, the coming insurrection says they not only settle for, but this is the strategy, is to create an area of control that coexists with the power. Now, if you would ask Arthur Scargill or the miners in the 1985 strike whether that's a good idea, it wasn't the main thing they were into. But now, because you can almost live in not, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, you can actually create your German social democratic village if you want, between you and your friends, and you can live in a kind of semi-freedom. I'm not saying that replaces the old, dynamics of revolution, which we know from history, but it does actually make, for example, if we look at the Iranian youth, that's where they're living in their own little secular middle class, both in real life. I mean, because Iranian, for middle class people, as long as you don't piss the mullahs off, you can actually do quite decent amount of social life in Iran. And they all know, like all these protesters, they all know each other. They know each other. They will know Hossein El Abalawi. They will know you probably, and one or two other, of the glitterati of the student Twitter people. They will know you. It's quite interesting. That, I'll tell you, it is new, and it's not about the protest. It's about what they are prepared to see as a stage in the achievement of the struggle. I don't know whether we in the media, because we constantly look for these hard black and white points, whether we've understood that.
Okay. Well, I won't confine myself to one sentence. I think that's a banal simplification encouraged by Twitter. I'm not going to restrict myself to. I agree with Paul, right? So, when Catherine was talking earlier, she said it's a tool. It's just like any other tool. What's interesting about it, really, it's not what it does. It sort of undermines, if you can put it this way, the sort of monopoly over information and collective action that was previously belonged to organisations, right? So previously, if you wanted to organise an event, if you wanted to organise a protest, if you wanted to organise an assembly of people, you would go through a political party, a trade union, or a sort of social movement organisation. Something like Stop the War organisation, which is the most recent example. In the book, one of the articles that I've co-written with someone else who's a student, Aaron Peters, we describe it as political activism going open source. So whereas before the tools for collective action, for information distribution were in the hands of a central organisation, political party, now everyone has access to these tools. And the question is not, does it allow people to gather in squares and overthrow their governments? I hope we can move on from that debate. It does, okay? There's some people who still want to insist that it doesn't, that the internet isn't transforming protest and social movements, but it does. It allows collective action on a grand scale, organised from below. So the key question is, does it actually also engender new forms of organisation? Does it encourage more horizontal forms of an organisation? Well, I think the answer to that is also yes, it does. So take the example of the student movement. Now, what happened there? The birth of the student movement happened on November the 10th. There was a large march, a classic A to B march, as it were, organised by the National Union of Students, a top-down organisation which went through the university student unions. It organised coaches. It got people down there. It had been planning it for months. It had a website. It had paid operatives from the centre who were controlling the message and the ideological self-understanding of the march, and they were keeping it very tame and reasonable, and they were desperate to be responsible to safeguard their future careers on the Labour front bench, perhaps, I don't know. So that's what you had, the NUS march, right? Now then, the march broke off and it took on a life of its own, and it ended up invading the Tory HQ at Millbank, and the leader of that, the official leader of that movement, Aaron Porter, went onto TV. He condemned this as despicable. He refused to back another wave of occupation and direct action organised by students, and as a result his legitimacy and his authority collapsed, and people were able, like Paul described, to self-organise outside of those normal central structures, using Facebook, using Twitter, using the power of the web to basically come together, organise more protests. Now they then, rather like in Egypt, actually, they went into occupation. They occupied a square in Egypt. We occupied administrative buildings, and then you form real-life bonds between people who you go to university with, and you form strong friendships. And from that was built the basis of an alternative movement. And throughout, in that time, the occupations became like the de facto leaderships of the student movement, and people gained an experience which was kind of a transformative experience for many of the thousands of people who took part in it, of self-organising and organising non-hierarchically, organising outside of the traditional structures of political parties, of unions, of social movement organisations on the top, and it's much more participatory. Just another thing, the one way of conceiving it is, for example, the media itself is obviously under threat by this media. The media, these sort of top-down, you've got the BBC, you've got the Guardian, you've got several other top-down media organisations, they're under threat from social media. you've also got record companies, you've got other institutions that did have monopolies over production and information and distribution, and they are now under threat. And the same thing is happening with political activism. Political parties, organisations, top-down structures are being threatened in all different spheres of cultural and political life. So,
I will be brief. I largely agreed with Turi on the subject of whether the social media themselves are creating or having to change the protest. I think the main thing is the way in which they enable information to be conveyed. Not so much organising the protest, but just the spreading of information. I lived in Tunisia for 2 years, about 20 years ago, and I was amazed about what happened in Tunisia, simply because people seemed so complacent, and the only information that they had was from state-run TV, which was a diet of what Ben Ali had done today, accompanied by floral arrangements and military music. So it provided them with information and alternative information. But again, as Turi said, do demonstrations and protests happen without social media? Sure they do, and in fact that was what happened in Egypt. People went out on the streets because they had no information, so you just go out on the streets.
There's one over here, but there's one here. Oh, see, so the microphone's already there.
Hi.
Okay, yeah.
Hi, yeah. My name's James. I work for the BBC News website, and I'd like to pick up on Guy's point there that somehow the BBC and the mainstream media are under threat from social media. I'd actually argue the opposite, and I'd be interested in what Paul has to say about this, because I actually think that the social media like Facebook and Twitter are bringing people to the BBC who would never visit the BBC website. Friends of mine who are activists are passing Paul's blog, 20 Reasons Why It's All Kicking Off Around the World, around themselves on Facebook and reading that, and they wouldn't tune in to the BBC or maybe even Al Jazeera, but they're using social media as a filter to find the content on the BBC website and on CNN that fits in with their ideology, and because it's coming via friends of theirs and peers and people whose politics they know, it's immediately appealing and trusted. And I'll give you an example. For the BBC website, I'm part of a team. We just created a map of Tahrir Square, which shows how the camp was organised. So how they set up recycling, how they set up clinics, how they set up where the bloggers were camped, and
Lost and found.
That's right. Yeah, there was the lost and found. I mean, I'd love to hear some examples from you. The story went up on Saturday and it was promoted with a big splash, and it did really well in the stats, as my colleague Martin Asser, who's here, will be able to explain. But by Tuesday, today, it's still getting lots of traffic. And we thought, why? We're not promoting this anymore. If you go to the BBC website, it's quite hard to find this map. So how on earth are people still reading this BBC article? And we looked through our stats website, and the reason that people are still reading our map is because it's on an Iranian activist portal, a banned Iranian activist portal, who've posted the BBC's map of Tahrir Square, I assume to start a discussion of how can we do this in Tehran. And you tell me that the BBC is in competition with social media. So my question would be, Paul, I mean, could you talk maybe about some of the new opportunities that a Newsnight journalist has as a result of being able to have your own personal audience who can just read your stuff rather than having to listen to Jeremy and Kirsty for a while?
Well, I think that's a whole different ball game, because it clearly changes the practice of journalism. I mean, I'll give you one thing. I don't know whether this is public, but now what output editors tonight on Newsnight, when I go back, when they're sitting in the gallery, they will have Twitter and they'll have a hashtag Newsnight and they'll watch what people are saying, and it's instant qualitative and quantitative research. Quantitative because there's enough. On a big night when Jeremy turns somebody over, hundreds a minute, and it's also quality because you can say, hold on a minute, that's Piers Morgan, he's watching, or whatever, whatever. That kind of quality sometimes you can do that. But actually, my blog did go quite viral, and it was because, I'll tell you, viraled it. Piers Morgan, Graham Linehan, Mark Thomas, and a couple of other people were the initial retweeters of it. Now, but I do think that what we're talking about is part of a much wider challenge, which is about society's challenge to the mainstream media. I'm from mainstream media, I'm in it, so are you, some of my colleagues are here. what would I say to them that the big difference is? A lot of people in society don't have any power whatsoever and any voice. And normally, in an ideal, in the average run of things, the mainstream media doesn't take much notice of them, or it shapes its narrative around them according to what it sees. But whoever they are, and in America, of course, it's the other way around. It's the right who do this. Whoever they are, they can bust if they're big enough, and if the meme is big enough. If enough people say, shit, we don't want Wall Street bailed out, what we want is a almost rule-free capitalism where everybody locks and loads their gun and shuts their doors, you can get that into the mainstream media because it's strong and it can fight back against what I call, and I think it's only A-level sociology, ideology. And ideologies are able to be challenged. It's a different subject, we should have a whole different meeting about it. The election in Britain, the way the spin doctors got taken apart on Twitter, you couldn't spin a lie out. And when you watch some of these spin doctors, try it, it's embarrassing. And you can almost, it was like seeing a whole room of people edge away from them. Do you know what I mean? Online though.
Airbrush for change. Airbrush for change. Remember that fantastic, the Conservative Party picture of David Cameron who suddenly lost all his wrinkles, no warts. And it sounds exactly like the story you were talking about Milosevic. Can I just add one thing to what Paul just said about that issue? I don't think that mainstream media is taking a whole new form of sourcing from social media, as you were describing the problems that you had in Tunisia. But it's also taken a new form. It's taken I've spoken about this before, and I've spoken about it here, which is my obsession with the live blog. The live blog seems to be one of the most exciting new forms of journalism. It is social journalism. It's social media performed by a paid Guardian, BBC, whoever it is, writer, who's taken all the ways in which we now understand media, which is, as I was trying to talk about before, unbundled, dislocated, bitty, from all sorts of different sources, and saying, you know what? I've just suddenly realised that my audience understands it. So you know what? You're going to get all of it. You're going to get it raw, and you can figure out what the story is yourself. It takes a very particular kind of hero to be able to do that, and they have to write 14,000 words an hour, but because they're producing so much content. And of course it's edited, and of course it's pulled together. But what that is it's sort of performing social media inside the mainstream media space. So they have learned an enormous amount from social media, and they've learned about their audience from social media, and they're producing content now which better suits that audience.
In parentheses, how easy was life once upon a time, not for broadcast journalists, but for print journalists who fundamentally had one set of deadlines at the end of their working day, and that's completely changed. Over there.
So I wanted to just kind of talk to you a little bit. It seems that I'm quite loath to pull the generational card on this, but it is very compelling. So I think that we've got a generation who are amazingly media literate, who are used to surfing kind of not 4 channels, but 400 channels, plus the internet, plus their mobile phone, plus a games console, etc. And so I've got really good at sorting the wheat from the chaff and so on. And what we seem to have seen recently, and it's a fairly small event in the context of some of what we've talked about, but the Jodie McIntyre interview on the BBC was this immediate backlash against what the BBC clearly felt was balanced and objective reporting on an issue. And we're absolutely kind of unable to cope with this backlash against it. So I guess there's kind of 2 questions, one from each side of things. First of all, do you think it's reasonable that people on Twitter and Facebook and all the other social media outlets seem to feel such a right to be offended and to have their offence listened to? And secondly, do you think that the mainstream media outlets are making any progress to kind of dealing with how you react to this online torch mob of people who are very angry about a Clarkson article or Little John or whoever it is who's offended the primarily liberal users of Twitter?
What was the first one?
The first one is, do people have a right to be offended? And secondly, how do you deal with people who feel they've got a right to be offended?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting one, because I mean, so with Twitter, one of the things that happens is that as soon as someone posts a horribly offensive article, like usually in the Daily Mail or something like that, sorry, Suzanne. Then it sort of usually goes viral on Twitter, and then people will be making complaints to the IPCC, or they'll be signing a petition or something. And the classic one this happened with was with Jan Moore, who wrote something along the lines of, there's nothing natural about the death of Stephen Gately, or something. It was a horrible, horrible, homophobic, spiteful piece about the death of the Boyzone singer Stephen Gately, and then it went all over Twitter, and then it went in loads of blogs and stuff. And her reputation, well, her Google reputation was certainly ruined. She stayed at the Daily Mail. But I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I see it as. The sort of accusation is it a sort of a form of censorship, I suppose? Is it a way of kind of like liberal people on Twitter censoring the views that they find unacceptable? I mean, I don't know. I don't see it as unproblematic as that. I mean, this is the age of the internet. We'd better get used to it. Your reputation online will be determined by all the sorts of things that are said about you, and it's not the same as censorship. It's pointing out disgusting, foul, homophobic speech and saying that's bad. It's not saying you're not allowed to publish it, you're not allowed to say those things. So I don't see it as problematic as that. I think people have a right to be offended. People have a right to discuss it online. They used to discuss it on the pub. Now they'll discuss it in Twitter. And I think social norms are going to adapt and will be less sort of sensitive about what people are saying about us online, and will forgive people for past indiscretions and so on. So I think that's what I'd say to that.
Thank you. Yes.
I wanted to make 2 points.
No, it's yours. I'm just pointing for the microphone to go.
Sorry. The first point, I'm glad this issue of generation came up, because one of the things I've been thinking about lately over the last week or two, and then especially during the panel discussion, is I'm a writer from the States, and I participated back in the day in, of course, all the Vietnam War protests and the civil rights protests. And it's so interesting thinking about social media and what it does, this horizontal aspect of it that I think is so wonderful and so nonlinear, and the way it somehow gathers people. We didn't have any of that during the civil rights movement and during the anti-Vietnam War movement. And yet somehow, I don't know how it was, but it was so organic. I mean, millions of us would come together in the streets of Washington, and I'm not even sure half the time how we knew which days to be there. And I remember many times just saying to my brother, tomorrow we have to go lie in the street because such and such buildings have been segregated, or are still segregated, and then we'd go to this place to lie. We'd bring sandwiches with us and go to lie in the street and possibly get killed if need be. And it was interesting because everybody else was doing it too, and I remember thinking it just seemed so natural. You knew which days sort of not to bother, to stay home, which days to be there. There was something so organic. It was as if we had ESP. It was as if we had social media, but it was some sort of weird magnetic field happening between our heads, and so there's a certain power.
More drugs at those days.
Drugs definitely help, but there was something really organic about the sense of human nature, about the way it happened. I mean, it was very, very beautiful, and part of why it's been so moving to me in the last 3 weeks to see what's going on.
I'll take it as a comment unless you wanted to respond.
Well, I just wanted to just throw this in. I don't know what. Look, I always say, if you give Frodo Baggins a mobile phone, the plot of Lord of the Rings becomes a lot shorter. So while it is true that we're all intuiting these things, and all the social media does is it replicates real society, the thing is that so much of power rested in the 19th and 20th centuries on inability to communicate education. And I can remember the leftism of the 80s, people were recruited to it by, did you know this? Did you know that the Brits did this in Bangladesh in the war? Did you know this? Well, no, you do. And therefore it allows you to get to the end of the story, which is, what do you all think? Could Stokely Carmichael, could the Panthers have been turned over in the way they were turned over by COINTELPRO, by the American state, if they'd have had social media. It wouldn't have been the Panthers. Would there have been the leaders? Would there have been the whole hierarchy? No. So it is different, I argue.
We're running out of time, but there are several who've had their hands up. So you've got the microphone already, but just to flag, one more here in a moment, and Anthony there. And there are lots of others I know also, but there's 3 who've had their hand up for a long time. So
I'll keep this very brief. Bringing it back to Egypt for a moment. I was in Egypt twice for the, let's say, the smaller version, the attempted revolution, 2005 and 2008. It was the May the 4th. It was branded. It was termed in the Egyptian press as the Facebook revolution, just before they started calling Facebook kind of an idea thought up by Israel. And what I'd like to ask you is if anyone had followed those attempted revolutions, why this one worked. And it appeared that what social media achieved, and I hate to be the person that says social media brought a revolution into fruition because it seems like an incredibly dumb thing to say, but it appeared that the ability for people to see the effect of one action spread around the world was incredibly encouraging to bring people to the streets. I was speaking to my family in Egypt, and they were amazed by how the world saw Egypt, and that made them, proud to be Egyptian and want to be part of something which they were watching. They were part of the story. The story was encouraging. I don't mean to use Mubarak's line against Aljazeera, but it was something that enabled protesters to feel like they had power. So power can either be that you have the money that's in the central reserves, or power can mean that you have a voice on the television. So the question is, do you see this particular protest in Egypt as something that was encouraged by people being able to see themselves retweeted and then tweeted up to CNN, and that encouraged people to say, well, we're strong enough to bring down the government?
Well, I think I can see someone in the back who could probably answer that question better than I. Is that Ebba? Is that you there? Yeah. Ebba I met in Cairo on Saturday night, and she was very much involved. And so maybe someone could pass a microphone to Ebba and she could tell us. It's coming, Ebba.
Actually, I'm Egyptian. I wasn't in Egypt right from the start, right from the 25th. I live in Dubai now. But yes, I think so in short form, because the first few days I was stuck in Dubai, not being able to run down. My passport was stuck in the British embassy because I was meant to be there for work this week. So I couldn't go to Egypt. And what everyone felt they had, if they weren't able to be there, then at least they felt they had a role to play by communicating everything that they were able to get information on to the outside world. So, to build international pressure. And that's what a lot of us were doing. So we were on Facebook and Twitter 20 hours out of 24 hours a day, just communicating every single piece of information we could get by just connecting with people over landline when mobile phones and internet was switched off and whatnot. And what I think a lot of people felt was international opinion about what was going on in Egypt was for once, or about anything in the Middle East for that matter, was for once almost unified. It wasn't so controversial or so removed from the truth. And I think that gave people, yes, a sense of empowerment or a sense of righteousness about what they were doing as well, because everyone saw it through their eyes, or everyone saw their quest, in the same way. And everyone was quite keen on getting involved as well, because of the amount of attention that it sparked internationally, and how when I got here and I got into my cab from the airport just a couple of days ago, and I was going to the hotel, the cabbie was able to tell me every single piece of information about what happened from the 25th until today, hour by hour, because he was just so involved. And that's really, and that amazed everyone, because we were so, we're so used to the Middle East conflict with the Israeli-Palestinian issue and whatnot, for opinions to be so varied and to also sometimes be so removed from the truth. And I think, yes, that empowered a lot of people to just keep going. I don't think that, I think it was a feel-good thing. I think it gave everyone a good push, because of also the protests that happened everywhere in the world. It wasn't the reason that it succeeded, I don't believe, but I think, yes, it was quite important.
It's been growing. There's been a sort of trajectory over the last 5 years. So the Kifaya movement, 2005 in Egypt, was all over Flickr. It was nowhere else on Flickr. You think of the Pakistan lawyers movement a few years ago. That was all through SMS. They were motivating and keeping each other posted through SMS. Back in 2005, when Israel-Lebanon popped off, that was all on Blogger. Those were the tools. So we've learnt these things better, sort of more and more. The only sort of proviso I'd have, and I think it makes it much more interesting, is that I always got in the back of my mind what would have happened if this had been a Muslim Brotherhood social movement. And because I have a feeling that, so my natural sense is that one of the reasons that social media has been so driven over Tunisia and Egypt and now Bahrain and Yemen and elsewhere is because there's a sense that the audience for social media is broadly pro what's going on. Now, so that's a serious question. I think it talks to many of the things we've spoken about before, which is you have to permanently remind yourself that the demographic that you're talking to or hearing from on social media is a very particular demographic. It's not the whole story. But actually, what's interesting about Egypt, as is your story about Aljazeera, is actually the protesters weren't entirely clear whether mainstream media was on their team or not. So it sort of gives me a little bit more hope that social media is genuinely used for its own motivational power at a local level or within the demographic that it's coming out of, rather than just to go and say, guys, we're being beaten up over here, and hope that, as happened in Iran, and Iran is the terrible case of this, somehow you could invent a story which may or may not have been entirely true. So the absence of any news coming out of Iran for those 2-3 days motivated everybody on Twitter. Iranians in LA, just as pro sort of anti-mullahs in Montana, to push these stories out. Did they have any were they reflecting in any way real what was actually going on in Iran? Now I think we're more real.
We're fast running out of time. I know there are three. You've got, and you've got, yes, okay, one here. One here's been waiting extremely patiently, and there will be one there. Fine.
Okay, yeah. I'm Anthony Barnett from Our Kingdom, Open Orcs Our Kingdom, along with Guy and others here, and we published the book. Some of you have got the leaflet, the Fight Back book. And I want to put a question really to Paul Mason, because it seems to me, if I could say so, there's a contradiction in two of the things that you said. On the one hand, there was one vision, which is that there is now flat movements, as in who are self-organizing and can create alternative kind of communities outside of the mainstream. But it seemed to me, and the reason why I was very motivated as a kind of 68 veteran in terms of watching what was happening over the protests of November and December, is that this was quite different from what was going on then. This wasn't a separatist. The kind of things that Guy and many others were doing was moving from a protest over fees to a protest over cuts, to a protest over the government strategy, to a politics which was making a claim on the nature of government itself. So that this wasn't a separatist student movement. This is an anti-cuts movement which has got very big implications. And I think that's where UK Uncut came out of it, but got a lot of mainstream publicists, because they were demanding that regular people, owners of Topshop, etc., paid their taxes. So this, and it's the capacity it gives people who are outside of the traditional power structures to challenge the way the society itself is run, and their understanding of that, and what Felix, who was just asked a question about, the new generation being socially kind of being media savvy, who published the book, that's part of what is now happening, is that there's now a capacity to enter the mainstream which is much greater, not a separate, we can create our own little horizontal world.
Well, look, I'm not trying to describe the whole world. My thing is a blog. You should look it up, Paul Mason, BBC. All I'm trying to do is describe part of the world, and in many ways it's disarticulated. What I describe, funnily enough, some people in it, what I meant as weaknesses, they think, "Wait, this is great. You're describing our strengths." No, all I'm doing is describing what I think some of the key features of these spontaneous, intelligentsia-led social movements, savvy movements do. and what I was trying to do was take it beyond it's all on Twitter and into the what is it of the Guy Debord situationist, autonomist. I mean, some of my colleagues, I have to say, they're not anarchists, they're autonomists. What does it matter? Well, to them it matters, okay, to some people. I'm just trying to educate some of my peers about what's going on, but I am not purporting to describe the whole world. The MB still acts like the MB. The Tea Party movement, though it uses some, social media, does not act like the UCL occupation. It doesn't. And so you have to just understand the limits of this. I mean, in the blog I say, what happens when they run into 300 Abrams tanks? Well, we now know that Obama has to sort it out, but it's still Obama. I'd still argue that there was a huge element of top-down going on in the Egyptian revolution. I don't know whether you have any greater knowledge than me on that, but I'm not arguing the whole thing is some kind of situationist international spontaneous thing altogether. It's just that when there's a bit of it, this is what its inner dynamics are.
Thank you. We're absolutely running out of time. We have two promised voices. There's one in the third row. You've already got the microphone. Okay, person with the microphone, and the person here in the third row has also been promised since some time ago. So go with the person who's got the microphone, that's fine.
Hi. I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on the difference in the way that international protests... I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on the difference in the way that international protests are covered as opposed to domestic protests here by sort of the UK mainstream media. There's a sort of obvious romanticization, I think, of international protests versus the way they're covered here. And I was just wondering if that has to do with kind of perceived legitimacy or political opinions, sort of access to more opinions here than you get when you don't have people on the ground. Maybe the sort of political corporate agenda that Guy was talking about earlier, any of those kind of things.
Great question.
A good question. Speaking as a former foreign correspondent, one of the huge differences, of course, is that a foreign correspondent, you're allowed to take a view, roughly speaking, that these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. Whereas as a correspondent in the UK, for most media, not some of the new stuff, but for most, it's more difficult. Paul, do you want to take it?
No, I'm rattled on a lot.
Well, I mean, for my medium, for Aljazeera, it's kind of different anyway, because we don't have any domestic news and international news. There is no home news. I mean, there's not a lot going on in Qatar, to be frank.
There might be soon.
So it's all international. It's all international news, and so there isn't that kind of distinction.
Well, there is quite a lot. I just heard again through the Twitter sphere and all the stuff that Ben Ali is in Qatar. So,
what do you think?
First heard on Twitter. There's an interesting one to throw into the room. Yes, you have the microphone.
Yeah, I suppose my question's mainly for Jacky and Paul, really, about whether the availability of footage generated by protest movements themselves gives mainstream broadcasters a sort of new sense of responsibility. And by that I mean throughout history, really, there's always been it's always been more interesting to cover people throwing themselves onto horses or stabbing people in baths or dressing up as a superhero and standing on a bridge than it is covering people writing petitions and going on a nice, peaceful, quiet demonstration. And so a small group of people doing a big dramatic action has always got more coverage than lots and lots of people doing something quite well behaved. And but what's always been the case up till now is that at least a journalist could make a decision about whether they felt something was sort of editorially worthy of coverage based on some of their own sort of independent criteria, whereas nowadays you've got people sending you footage of their own demonstrations. And so, for example, on Newsnight a couple of weeks ago there was a piece about UK Uncut, which looked, I think it was described as sort of an independent film, so it was made by people, if not within the movement, who were extremely sympathetic to the movement and played pretty much uncut by the looks of things. And that was quite a benign kind of protest. They were just sort of occupying boots or something briefly. But with protesters sort of all having availability of cameras and things themselves, do you think you're going to find yourself, or maybe you're already finding yourselves, in a position where you're getting footage that is perhaps of something very violent or perhaps of something very extreme that would make very juicy television, but it's because are you sort of allowing there to be a market there for things that would mean that people protest in more extreme ways than if you weren't taking that sort of material. Particularly, I suppose, so I'll shut up in a second, but in the sort of flat earth news world that we're in, where there's, you know, less money available for journalists to go out and actually cover their own stories.
More for me, it provides opportunities for television that weren't previously there. There are certain stories that you can tell as a newspaper journalist or even as a radio journalist, but as a television journalist, unless you've got pictures, you can't tell it. And it's actually given us the opportunity. I mean, I was talking to you about when I was in Alexandria for the Egyptian elections. You know, we were with these young people who were talking about, they were already talking about Khalid Said. I mean, they'd already, you know, the website was already up and running, and there were these young people, you know, including the young girl who said the beating she had made her stronger. You know, they were involved in this very, very small group. And previously, I would have found it extremely difficult to do a television story about this. And so it's not somehow that the juicy content or whatever out there is kind of dictating what you do. It's providing you with a visual means to tell stories that otherwise you'd have been very hard-pressed to tell. So when they talk about the police techniques and when they talk about the oppression, you've actually got some YouTube footage which is actually very, very grainy and very poor, but enables you to see, when they're talking about kettling, it enables you to see in quite clear and graphic terms. So we even kind of slow-mode it down and did it twice, so you can put a circle around and you show, you know, how the police, you know, literally suck them out, and as they get expelled to the outer ring, they get handed over to the mukhabarat to beat the hell out of them. And so for us, it doesn't dictate, or it doesn't in any way kind of. We don't find ourselves covering things because there's juicy footage out there. It's just that if we want to tell a story and we lack the visual tools to tell it, we now have a new place that we can look for those visual tools.
Can I put them there?
Very briefly.
Okay. Well, I find it very interesting the way the whole Egyptian protest is now being framed and presented in the media. I mean, you had the sort of the spectacle, right? Like Paul refers to Guy Debord. You had the spectacle in Tahrir Square, which was a mass gathering of people. You also had stuff that doesn't really get reported, certainly not in the BBC, which was, you had strikes all around the country. You had strikes in Suez, you had strikes in textile factories and chemical factories and state-run factories, you had sit-ins, you had people blocking off highways. Now, okay, is it the fact that the working class people who were taking part in those kinds of protests didn't have Twitter, didn't have phones, weren't able to relay them to the media? That's one part of it, I think. But also, my suspicion is that the media has an interest in portraying a particular view of dissent, which is largely a static, immobile demonstration, peaceful within a square, that ultimately brought down the regime, when actually it was much more complicated than that. And
I'm going to have to shoot you down there, I'm afraid, my friend. No, I mean, we were.
Al Jazeera is different, I think.
I mean, we were covering those movements. We were covering those movements as well to the best of our ability. But you have to remember that Al Jazeera had been inadvertently made part of the story. We had teams in Suez, we had teams in other places who were going out and covering those things and actually having their life threatened. And as Al Jazeera had to flee for their lives because they'd been sucked into the story, they were accused of being foreign agents, potentially even Israeli spies who'd come to agitate stuff. So your ability to cover a story when you've actually got a baying mob that want to lynch you, you know, it's somewhat of an impediment. You know, it's nothing to do with censorship; it's to do with staying alive.
On which powerful point, the discussion will continue, and I think many of it, perhaps all of the panel, will still be here. But thank you very, very much.